There is a kind of strength that doesn't come from pride or pretty phrases or applause. It comes when life backs someone into a corner with no witnesses and says, without words, "Now it's up to you." And it's in that corner that many women learn to hold themselves up, not because they wanted to be independent, but because at some point, depending became dangerous, because trusting became a gamble, because waiting became a slow humiliation. There's a detail that almost no one notices. The woman who learned to be strong completely alone usually carries a calm that isn't exactly peace. It's a trained calm, a stability built like you build a wall after a break-in, not for aesthetics, but out of necessity. On the outside, she seems fine. On the inside, there's an emotional intelligence that was forced to mature early. And that changes the way she walks through life. She observes more, talks less, promises little, delivers what's necessary. She isn't impressed by speeches. She guides herself by consistency. She doesn't fall in love with intensity. She respects what stays. Carl Jung would have a lot to say about this, not as distant theory, but as a lens to see a human phenomenon. When life demands that someone get strong early, the psyche creates strategies. One of those strategies is the persona, the social mask that lets us function, be accepted, not get hurt again. The persona can be the image of the competent woman, decisive, who handles it, who doesn't fall. And that persona is useful because it protects. But Jung would also warn, when the persona sticks too much to the face, the person starts confusing mask with identity. And then what was protection turns into prison. Because the woman starts to believe she only has value when she's strong, when she's useful, when she's controlled. And without realizing it, she becomes incapable of resting without guilt, incapable of asking without shame, incapable of receiving without feeling like she's owing her own soul. The word alone is central here. It's not just absence of company, it's absence of support. It's the feeling that, when something squeezes, there's no lap, no net, no space to fall. Whoever lives that for long enough learns a lesson that seems virtuous but is painful. Don't count on anyone. Sometimes that lesson saves. In moments of abandonment, it prevents collapse. In phases of chaos, it allows crossing through. But over time, it can become a rigid belief, as if every bond was a hidden threat. And then the strength stops being a choice and turns into a reflex. The woman isn't strong because she wants to. She's strong because she doesn't know how to be any other way. Stoicism talks to this in a direct and sober way. For the Stoics, there are things that depend on us and things that don't. What depends on us? Our judgments, our actions, our inner posture. What doesn't? Other people's behavior, recognition, the world's stability, the unexpected. The woman who learned to be strong alone in many cases became a Stoic without naming it. She put energy into what she could control. She stopped negotiating with the unpredictable. She built discipline, self-control, pragmatism, and that's admirable. But there's a point where discipline gets confused with hardness, self-control gets confused with anesthesia, and pragmatism gets confused with a heart that closes to not get beaten again. Jung would call attention to the shadow, what the consciousness doesn't want to see in itself, what was repressed, denied, pushed down. And the shadow isn't just the bad. Many times, the shadow is the part that the person couldn't live. The anger she swallowed to not lose love. The sadness she silenced to not be a burden. The desire to be taken care of that she interpreted as weakness. The need to depend, which is human, but which became dangerous in a history of neglect. When that shadow isn't recognized, it rules from below like an underground current. It shows up in excessive control, in automatic distrust, in impatience, in internal demands, in difficulty relaxing, in a tiredness that doesn't go away because the body never leaves alert mode. And here's where a paradox lives. Many of these women are generous. They welcome, organize, sustain, resolve, protect. They become references. People lean on them. And that, on one hand, gives meaning. On the other, it reinforces the prison. If I fall, who holds everything? But no one should live like an eternal column. A column holds up, yes, but a column also cracks when the load is continuous and silent. The problem is that the strong woman rarely allows herself to crack in front of someone. She prefers to crack inside. And that creates a very specific type of loneliness. The loneliness of being seen as strong all the time, even when she's too tired to keep representing her own strength. There's a subtle trait that accompanies this story. The mind turns into a sentinel. It learns to predict, calculate, anticipate. Not out of mania, but for survival. Whoever lived emotional instability tends to seek stability in details. Schedules, plans, routines, financial control, lists, organization, self-restraint. And that can be healthy, up to the point where rest becomes impossible. Because resting is letting down the guard. And letting down the guard, for someone who's been hurt, sounds like an invitation to get hurt again. So she stays alert even when she doesn't need to. The body gets used to tension. Breathing gets short. Sleep gets light. Patience shortens. Pleasure always gets put off for later. And later almost never comes because there's always something to resolve. If you observe with honesty, you'll notice that this solitary strength also shapes the way she relates. She doesn't get enchanted easily by promises. She doesn't hand over intimacy just because someone seems nice. She evaluates consistency. She notices inconsistencies. She feels when a word doesn't match an attitude. She might even smile, but she doesn't give herself. And many times that's misinterpreted. It's called coldness, difficulty loving, demanding. But behind it, there can be a radical loyalty to herself. She decided she's not going back to places where she has to shrink to be accepted. Decided she's not begging for presents. Decided she's not negotiating respect. That seems like hardness to someone who lives in emotional improvisation. But for her, it's hygiene. It's belated self-care. There's also a silent grief that accompanies this type of strength. The grief for a lighter version of herself. The woman who learned to be strong alone sometimes looks at more spontaneous people, more confident, more loose, and feels something hard to name. It's not exactly envy, nor contempt. It's a mix of longing and question. What would life be like if I'd been taken care of the right way? That grief can turn into bitterness if denied, or it can turn into maturity if accepted. The Stoic would say, don't fantasize the past as if it could be changed. Use what happened as material to build virtue now. Jung would say, face the pain without identifying with it. Integrate what was left behind so that life isn't just repetition of defense. And that's exactly why talking about the signs of these women isn't reducing anyone to a label. It's offering a mirror. Because when these signs become conscious, the strength can transform. It stays firm, but gets wiser. Stays independent, but gets more human. Stays lucid, but less armed. And the goal isn't becoming dependent, nor becoming fragile. The goal is recovering choice, being strong when necessary, and soft when possible, keeping boundaries without closing the heart, sustaining life without abandoning herself in the process. Maybe the most honest question to start this path is simple and uncomfortable. Is this strength in you freedom or defense? It protects you, yes. But does it also let you love, rest, receive, trust, exist without always proving yourself? Because there's a strength that comes from consciousness and a strength that comes from trauma. On the outside, they might look the same. On the inside, one breathes, the other watches. And when you start recognizing these signs, something changes in the way you look at yourself. You stop condemning yourself for not trusting fast. Stop blaming yourself for being selective. Stop feeling ashamed for being tired. And at the same time, start noticing what you don't need to carry alone anymore. Because true maturity isn't becoming impenetrable. It's becoming whole. There are women who didn't learn to be strong. They learned to be predictable to themselves. Predictability turns into a form of shelter. If I organize myself, I protect myself. If I anticipate, I'm not surprised. If I control what I can, I don't beg for what I can't. And the world usually applauds that because it gives results. But the soul doesn't measure life just by results. The soul measures by wholeness. And that's where the signs start to appear, not as defects, but as little clues of what this strength cost. One of the most common signs is the automatic refusal to ask for help, even when it would be simple. It's not a theatrical refusal like, "I don't need anyone." It's more discreet, almost polite. "Let me do it. No need. It's all good." On the outside, it looks like autonomy. On the inside, many times it's memory. Asking for help requires a type of hope. The hope that the other won't fail. And whoever leaned on broken promises learns not to deposit their own well-being in anyone's hands. Jung would call this an ego adaptation. The I learns to preserve itself by creating an internal pact. The pact is silent, but powerful. If I depend, I expose myself. And when that pact turns into law, the person might even be surrounded by people but keeps living as if alone. Stoicism helps understand the beauty and danger of this trait. It's virtuous to do what's under your control and not despair over what's not. But there's a difference between moral self-sufficiency and emotional isolation. The Stoic seeks serenity, not absence of bonds. The problem is when serenity turns into just a pretty name for armor. The woman starts to endure everything quietly, not because she's at peace, but because she learned that showing need costs a lot. And over time, she doesn't even know how to distinguish what's dignity and what's fear of vulnerabilizing herself. Another sign reveals itself in the way she deals with promises and speeches. She isn't impressed by intensity. She doesn't move for quick enthusiasm. She observes. She waits. She measures consistency. And that doesn't come from coldness. It comes from experience. When someone says, "I'm here," she doesn't react with euphoria. She registers and follows along. For a lot of people, that seems demanding. For her, it's emotional hygiene. Jung would say that the psyche, after certain wounds, develops a harder sense of reality. The word loses value when it doesn't find body. And then, trust stops being a leap of faith. It turns into a slow construction, made of small, repeated facts. That makes the woman selective, yes, but also protects her from falling into fantasies. And here a third sign appears: sensitivity to inconsistencies. She notices when someone changes tone, when a kindness seems like interest, when a compliment hides control, when a silence is punishment. Not because she wants to look for defects, but because her mind learned to read signs to stay safe. Jung would call this an increase in the intuitive function in response to chaos. When the environment was unpredictable, the unconscious tries to compensate by offering fine, almost instinctive perceptions to avoid new falls. That sign is precious, but can become a trap when the person starts interpreting everything as threat. Intuition turns into vigilance, and vigilance tires. The body wasn't made to be always ready. There's also the sign of practical control. She plans, organizes, foresees, creates alternatives. Sometimes that shows up in small details. Always having a plan B, always carrying what might be necessary, always checking everything twice, always avoiding being left hanging. And again, that can be wisdom. But, in excess, it reveals fear of the unpredictable. Stoicism teaches to prepare without enslaving yourself to preparation, to accept that life is unstable and that real stability lives in the inner posture. When the woman doesn't trust that internal base, or when she hasn't had a chance to build it calmly, she tries to build external base with control, and external control has limits. One unexpected thing is enough for the body to go on alert and the mind to try to recover dominance at any cost. It's at that point that a very characteristic emotional trait emerges: the difficulty of relaxing even when everything's fine. She sits to rest, but the mind keeps working. She has a free moment but feels guilt. She receives affection but distrusts the price. She hears a compliment but wants to minimize it, not because she doesn't deserve it, but because receiving puts her in a place she doesn't know, the place of being taken care of without needing to prove efficiency. Jung would say that the unconscious keeps a record. At some point, trusting brought pain. So even in front of good, the internal system asks, and if this is temporary? The body stays rigid, as if tranquility was just a pause before the next demand. And there's an even more intimate sign: the way she deals with her own pain. Many of these women don't break down right away. They cross through. They resolve. They do what needs to be done. And only later, When everything's quiet, when no one else sees, the emotion appears. It's as if the psyche had learned a survival order. Act first, feel later. That explains why she seems so strong in crises and so tired when the crisis passes. The body holds during the storm and charges in the calm. If that dynamic repeats for years, the woman can become excellent at handling it, but terrible at processing. And what isn't processed doesn't disappear. It accumulates in the form of tension, irritation, impatience, nameless sadness, a sensation of emptiness, an exhaustion that doesn't resolve with sleep. Jung would call attention to the shadow here. The shadow can be the accumulated anger for having carried too much. It can be resentment for always being the adult in the room. It can be sadness for not having been supported. It can even be silent envy of those who had a lap, not in a petty sense, but in the human sense of someone who looks at the care received by others and feels grief. I wanted to have been taken care of like that too. When the shadow isn't recognized, it escapes through cracks. The woman becomes hard without noticing, demands too much of herself, loses patience with those who are slower, doesn't tolerate others' fragility because her fragility was forbidden for a long time. And then strength turns into a rigid moral. If I handled it, you can handle it. But that's not justice. It's pain trying to justify itself. Stoicism, when well understood, softens that point, because it doesn't teach to despise fragility, but to put fragility in the right place, as part of the human condition. The Stoic isn't a man or woman of stone. It's someone who learns not to get lost in excess. Stoic maturity doesn't say don't feel. It says feel without being destroyed. And that can be liberating for a woman who learned to survive by silencing. She realizes that self-control doesn't need to be self-abandonment. She can keep posture without denying the heart, can be firm without punishing herself. And when these signs come together, a pattern appears. She becomes competent for the world, but sometimes absent from herself. She fulfills, delivers, resolves, sustains. And it gets harder and harder to remember what it's like to be taken care of, what it's like to trust without watching, what it's like to rest without guilt, what it's like to admit need without shame. The paradox is that, many times, she doesn't want to depend. She just wants the peace of not carrying everything alone all the time. She doesn't want to become fragile. She just wants to stop being invincible. There's a turning point that starts small and is deeply transformative. Recognizing that asking for help isn't regression. It's an act of reality. It's saying, I don't need to prove anything to exist. And recognizing that doesn't diminish the strength. It refines the strength. Because the most mature strength isn't the one that handles everything. It's the one that chooses what's worth handling and what should be shared. In the end, these signs aren't a sentence. They're a map. A map of a psyche that learned to protect itself and now can learn to live itself. Because life doesn't improve just when we get stronger. It improves when we get more conscious. And consciousness is when strength stops being reflex and turns into choice. A choice that doesn't harden you inside to keep everything standing outside. There's a type of strength that reveals itself less in big decisions and more in small habits. In the way of responding to messages. In the mode of entering a room. In the form how the person deals with a simple unexpected, like a flat tire, an unexpected bill, a crossed word. The woman who learned to be strong alone usually has a quick reaction, almost automatic. She doesn't allow herself to stay in shock for long. Shock is a luxury. She goes straight to the solution because at some point in life the solution was the only thing that avoided the worst. And that's where a deep sign appears. The tendency to assume responsibility for what isn't always hers. She gets ahead. She covers. She fixes. She appeases. In family, at work, in relationships, she turns into the person who holds the ends before the thing crumbles. And the curious thing is that, many times, no one asked. But her body learned that if she doesn't do it, someone will suffer, and that someone could be her. So she does it. And over time, that turns into a known place, the place of the permanent adult. Jung would call that a responsibility complex, a kind of emotional knot that pulls the person to the role of sustenance. It's not just being helpful. It's an identity that comes from fear of chaos and the memory of abandonment. But that role charges a very specific price. She starts to feel she can't fail. And when she can't fail, she can't be fully human. She becomes efficient, but hardened. She turns into the one who resolves, but not the one who receives. She turns into the one who welcomes, but not the one who asks for a lap. And it's at that point that a second sign appears: discomfort with genuine care. When someone offers affection without asking for anything in return, something inside her finds it strange. Not because she doesn't want it, but because free care is almost unbelievable for someone who got used to paying dearly for any crumb. This manifests in simple ways. A compliment, and she responds with a joke, minimizing. A gift, and she tries to compensate quick as if she needed to balance the scale. A kindness, and she thanks, but gets tense, waiting for the charge. It's as if the heart said, "This is good," and the defense system said, "This is dangerous." Jung would talk about a conflict between parts. The ego, which wants control and security, and a deeper part, which yearns for bond and rest. When those parts don't talk, life turns into a constant negotiation between desire and fear. Stoicism can help here in a direct way. Distinguish fact from interpretation. The fact is that someone is being kind now. The interpretation, inherited from the past, says that every kindness has a price. The strong woman usually confuses interpretation with reality because in the past, the interpretation proved true many times. And that's why re-educating trust requires prudence, not naivety. She doesn't need to give herself to the first nice gesture, but she can allow herself to recognize, not everything is a trap. Allowing that nuance is a huge advance because nuance is a sign of maturity. Defense works in black and white, either trust totally or don't trust. Maturity works in gray, observe, feel, evaluate, advance little by little. Another sign appears in the way she emotionally separates when she notices inconsistency. She doesn't make a scene. She doesn't fight for attention. She doesn't threaten. She just distances herself inside. Sometimes she stays present physically, but is already left inside. That distancing is a self-protection mechanism. I'm not going to humiliate myself. And there's nobility in that. But when it turns into a pattern, she can cut bonds before processing, before saying the essential, before allowing the other to repair something. The fear of depending makes her prefer to lose than negotiate vulnerability. Jung would say that in many cases this is a way to avoid encountering the original wound. Because when she faces the possibility of talking, asking for clarity, saying, "This hurt me," she touches the place where one day she was ignored. And touching that place hurts more than leaving. So she leaves. And for those looking from outside, it seems like coldness. But inside, many times, it's just a choice not to reopen what took years to scar. There's also a more silent sign that few people understand. The strong woman usually has high standards not out of vanity, but for self-preservation. She doesn't tolerate vague promises, doesn't tolerate constant emotional instability, doesn't tolerate lack of respect in a joking tone. She becomes careful with her own time and her own energy. That can be confused with rigidity, but many times it's the result of a history where she had to rebuild herself without help. After building her own life with her own hands, she doesn't want to lend that effort anymore to someone who lives as if everything was provisional. And here comes a powerful Jungian idea. When the person goes through experiences of helplessness, she can develop a rigid animus inside herself. The animus in Jung is the internal figure linked to the masculine principle in the woman's psyche, not in the social sense, but in the psychological. Direction, firmness, logic, decision, structure. In women who needed to be strong alone, that principle can grow like an internal fortress. Be rational, don't trust, don't expose yourself, resolve everything. That gives capacity but can harden contact with feeling. She becomes excellent at deciding but can get distant from her own affect. And then a life emerges well-resolved outside and little nourished inside. This is a delicate point, because it's not about becoming emotional or lowering guard for anyone. It's about integrating. The healthy animus isn't a general who shouts orders. It's a firm guide that protects without crushing. Integration happens when she realizes she can use rationality in service of life, and not against life. She can keep criteria without turning everything into a test. Can have boundaries without turning everything into a threat. There's still a sign that hides in everyday details. The difficulty of celebrating. She conquers something and, instead of feeling joy, already thinks about the next problem. She finishes a stage and, instead of breathing, already prepares for the next challenge. The Stoic would say that's a mind stuck in the future, and the future is always uncertain. Jung would say that can be an escape from the present because the present, when good, requires relaxation, and relaxing requires trust. That's why many strong women have difficulty feeling pleasure without guilt. Pleasure seems like distraction, as if something would collapse if she allowed joy. And it's not rare for that to manifest in the body. A tension that doesn't let go, a shoulder always high, a jaw clenched, breathing short, a sleep that doesn't deepen. The body denounces what the mind tries to hide. There's still internal threat, even when external life has already changed. Strength, in that case, isn't just an attitude, it's a physiological state. And that changes everything, because it's not enough to understand rationally. You need to learn to come down from alert mode. That can start with small and consistent gestures, walking without hurry, eating with presence, sleeping with a ritual that signals safety, decreasing stimuli, saying no without justifying, allowing pauses without filling every minute with productivity. Those things seem simple, but for someone who lived in alert, they're acts of courage. Another important sign, she doesn't tolerate depending financially, emotionally, or even logistically on someone. She prefers to have her own keys, her own money, her own paths. That's autonomy, and it's healthy. But in some cases behind it, there's a deep belief. If I depend, I lose power. If I lose power, I can be hurt. Stoicism helps redefine power. True power isn't controlling others. It's not being slave to fear. And that means she can stay autonomous and, at the same time, allow healthy interdependence, that exchange where each one is whole, but chooses to walk together. And maybe the most intimate sign of all is this. The strong woman usually talks to herself in a hard way. Her internal voice is efficient but sometimes cruel. She demands maturity from herself all the time. She charges perfection. She calls herself weak when she gets tired. And that voice is usually inheritance from an environment where fragility had no space. Integrating that point is essential, because self-control without compassion turns into self-punishment. And self-punishment disguised as strength is a sophisticated way of abandoning herself. When this woman starts to mature for real, something subtle happens. She keeps the firmness, but decreases the hardness. She continues with boundaries, but doesn't live in suspicion. She continues capable, but doesn't define herself only by what she delivers. She learns to recognize a simple truth. I was strong because I needed to, but I don't need to keep living as if I was still alone. It's not an emotional decree. It's training. Training to allow the good. Training to receive without guilt. Training to say, I need, without shame. Training to rest without feeling like she's failing. And that, deep down, is individuation, stopping being just the sum of defenses and becoming a whole person, with firmness and tenderness living in the same body. Stoicism offers the axis. Jung offers the integration. And life, silently, starts to get lighter not because the problems ended, but because the person stopped carrying the world as if it was proof of value. In the end, the strength that comes from loneliness isn't a medal. It's a solution. A solution that life imposed when support was uncertain, when care came with condition, when someone's presence seemed more promise than reality. And maybe that's why so many strong women carry a discreet shine in their eyes and, at the same time, a kind of tiredness that isn't explained just by routine. Because there's a tiredness that comes from resolving the world outside while holding herself, inside, to not ask anything from anyone. If you recognized yourself in part of what was said, it's important to remember. These signs aren't character defects. They're psychic adaptations. They're strategies that made sense when the environment wasn't safe enough to trust, when vulnerability seemed a risk, when depending meant being exposed. The psyche, to survive, does what it needs. It creates masks, it creates defenses, it creates control. Jung would call that an intelligence of the unconscious trying to preserve integrity. Stoicism would call it discipline in the face of the inevitable. But both Jung and the Stoics would agree on something essential. When defense turns into identity, life shrinks. And you weren't born to live shrunk inside, even if outside everything is under control. There's a silent difference between being strong and living in a state of alert. Being strong is having access. Living in alert is always waiting for the next blow, even when no one's hitting. Being strong is choosing with lucidity. Living in alert is reacting automatically. Being strong is enduring what needs to be endured. Living in alert is carrying even what was never yours. And many women, without noticing, confuse these two things because alert was the way to stay on feet for years. But the body wasn't made to sustain permanent war. The mind wasn't made to watch all the time. The heart wasn't made to close and call that maturity. The noblest strength isn't the one that never needs. It's the one that knows how to recognize need without humiliating itself. There's a difference between asking and begging. Asking is a human gesture. Begging is a gesture of someone who doesn't feel worthy. The woman who learned to be strong alone at some point may have mixed the two things. May have learned that asking is dangerous because before asking meant being ignored, ridiculed, or charged. But emotional maturity starts when you separate past and present inside yourself. When you realize that your history explains your reflexes but doesn't need to command your destiny. Jung said in essence that what doesn't become conscious repeats as if it was luck or bad luck. The pattern disguises itself as destiny. And here the pattern can be this: choosing relationships where you carry more than you receive, turning into the adult in the room in any environment, feeling guilt when resting, feeling distrust in front of simple love, having difficulty celebrating, refusing care and calling that independence. When you bring that to consciousness, you don't lose the strength. You gain freedom. Because strength stops being reflex and turns into choice. And Stoicism comes in as a silent axis. You don't control what others do, but control what you allow inside yourself. You control your posture, you control your judgments, you control what you feed mentally when you're alone. That means that, even if the world stays imperfect, you can build a more dignified way of living with it, without hardening yourself to survive. The Stoic posture isn't endure everything. It's act with virtue and accept with serenity what doesn't depend on me. And for someone who lived in alert, accepting doesn't mean resigning to injustice. Accepting means stopping emotionally mutilating yourself, trying to control the uncontrollable. Maybe the deepest transformation for a woman who learned to be strong alone is this: allowing herself internal rest without fear of falling apart. Because deep down, there's a hidden belief that governs a lot of this behavior. If I relax, I fall. And that belief may have been true back there when you had no net, when you had no resources, when you had no maturity, when you had no choice. But life changes. You change. And there comes a moment when continuing to live as if it was yesterday turns into a form of emotional delay, not for incapacity but for habit. Individuation, this Jungian process of becoming who you are, doesn't require that you abandon your discipline, your firmness, your autonomy. It just requires that you integrate what was left out. The right to feel, the right to be taken care of, the right to admit tiredness, the right to not be perfect, the right to not be the column all the time. Integrating the shadow in this case can mean recognizing an old anger without turning that anger into poison. Recognizing an old sadness without making it identity. Recognizing a desire to be welcomed without calling that weakness. When you recognize, you stop being governed from below. You start governing yourself from inside. And that's much rarer than it seems, because a lot of people confuse healing with becoming another person. Healing, almost always, is coming back to yourself. It's recovering a spontaneity that was interrupted. It's allowing the heart to breathe without the mind panicking. It's learning to trust with criteria, not with naivety. It's choosing bonds where you don't need to prove anything to have a place. It's realizing that healthy love doesn't require you to be invincible. It just requires truth and reciprocity. If your strength was built in absence, honor that history. It brought you here. It protected you when you needed. But don't allow it to become an elegant prison. Life doesn't ask you to be impenetrable. Life asks you to be whole. And wholeness is when firmness and tenderness can live in the same person without destroying each other. When you can say no without hate and yes without fear. When you can rest without guilt. When you can accept help without feeling you're losing value. When you can look at yourself with respect, not just with demand. Maybe you don't need to get stronger. Maybe you need to get freer. Free from the reflex of carrying everything. Free from the fear of needing. Free from the belief that vulnerability is danger. Free from the idea that love always has a price. Free to choose presence instead of proof. Free to live without turning every day into a silent battle. If this video helped you see something in yourself with more clarity, like the video so it reaches more people who also carry this silent strength. Write in the comments which of these signs you most recognize in your history. Share with someone you know who's been living in I can handle it mode for too long. And subscribe to the channel to keep deepening these reflections with calm, lucidity, and depth.